Mrs. Sarah Guthrie, granddaughter of Woody Guthrie.
As I was walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway. I saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. Let's sing it together. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. Oh, I've roamed and rambled, and I follow my footsteps through the sparkling sands of her diamond deserts, and all around me a voice was sounding. This land was made for you and me. All at once. This land is your land. This land is mine.
On the 17th of September 2019, from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. The title of our episode is Edward Snowden Patriot. Period. Nonetheless, Edward Snowden has been living in the Russian Federation now for 6 years. That is not a secret to anyone. Why did he appear there in the Russian Federation? Well, he was in Hong Kong and he was trapped. There were nations that wanted to give Edward Snowden asylum. But they received calls from then the Secretary Kerry at the time, and saying, well, you can give him asylum, but we, the American government, have very long memories, period. And they also received calls from the then Vice President Joe Biden. I haven't heard any comments from Lunchbox Joe about how he got into this particular scenario. This, the Edward Snowden events were handled under the administration of Barack Obama. Now, how did the U.S. get to where they are? Well, U.S. foreign policy was and is a domain of Wilsonian foreign policy that predominates it from named after the racist President Woodrow Wilson, who happened to be an academic. He was president of Princeton University, had a Ph.D., but that doesn't mean he could not be a garden in the variety racist. He segregated Washington, D.C. when he arrived on the scene. And at the same time, he tried to form, quote-unquote, a League of Nations. But the League of Nations itself never got formed. Later, the UN was formed, and this is where the American foreign policy is. And what we have will follow our brief commentary here is a number of interviews that Edward Snowden gave, known as Ed. Well, nonetheless, Ed talked to The Guardian, a progressive newspaper in the United Kingdom. He also talked to French 24 out of Paris, that channel. We felt that those were more balanced interviews of his. And finally, there's a short, about 8-minute clip, I believe, from the National Public Radio. And that is the most criminal, asking Ed Snowden, informing him that he is a traitor. Well, that's the first question we have to ask. Is Ed Snowden a traitor, or is he a patriot? Well, in the very fine tradition of quote-unquote whistleblowers that goes back to the Pentagon Papers. If you remember, the Pentagon Papers were the blueprint for the Vietnam War. And those were secured by Dr. Daniel Ellsberg, and they wanted to try Daniel Ellsberg, the same situation, under the Espionage Act. Now, what is the Espionage Act? Well, it was brought to being, we'll say, created in the early 1900s. There was a Red Scare going on at the time, and basically what it says is you can indict a person, and they really do not have an opportunity to bring forth a defense. In other words, they did it. Why they did it is excluded. Thus, under the U.S. Constitution, the 5th and the 14th, they are not allowed a full and fair hearing. Period. An individual that is brought before the dock, as in many parts of the world would think, or before the court in the U.S., you have to be afforded a full and fair hearing. And that is what Edward Snowden insists on. And he was asked by someone at the CBS News, you can't pick your trial. No, you can't pick the conduct of your trial. Only a fool would attempt to do something like that. Even the prosecution that has control of the elements of the trial, there are surprises from one that has participated in the court system, been involved there, been involved with clients. We understand what it means to have a trial. They can be very unpredictable, but at the same time, the prosecution has control of the trial from the indictment on. They always have the advantage. So what Ed Snowden would like to do is just tell the court why he did it. The CBS interview also brought up the oath that he took with the CIA. Well, that oath is very, very clear that you would defend the Constitution. Now, this is the Constitution, period. Against all enemies, foreign or domestic. And domestic, of course, there would be CIA procedures, and that's what Ed Snowden was exposing. Now, and he did, in fact, expose those procedures. But how were they exposed? Were they just dumped out there in whole? No. They were exposed via major commercial outlets in the U.S., such as the Pentagon Papers were, the New York Times, which has a history of collaborating with the U.S. government, the Washington Post, a national newspaper, the Guardian, etc., were some of the quote-unquote private partners in this particular adventure. So what Ed Snowden did was, and Ed Snowden had worked for the CIA, but at the time he was an independent contractor. We've done programs on that, so you can refer back to some of those. But, in fact, Jerry Pippin and I, our late broadcast partner, did various episodes on Ed Snowden and on due process, etc. We talked about due process, full and fair hearings during the quote-unquote trial of the century of the all-American hero Orenthal James Simpson. But what is to be remembered here is that his oath that he did with the CIA extended that signing agreements. You sign agreements when you work as a quote-unquote independent contractor, and that's what he was doing in Hawaii. He was an independent contractor, an IT contractor. What was his background? Well, he'd taken various college courses, and he'd also received the certificates from the Microsoft Enterprise, the Empire, what do you want to call it, to do these things, to be part of the networking efforts of the CIA that was contracted out. So thus he was privy to all kinds of information, the surveillance that they had, we'll say, and he talks about this, an individual that's on the surveillance, you could see the person at their computer, you could see the person's dog, or their daughter or son, or whomever happened to be in the room. All that information is available to the person monitoring that particular subject. Now, and the subject did not necessarily have to be a threat to national security, but they were under quote-unquote surveillance. Doesn't mean they were guilty of anything. And when we read his book, we'll get the story. We'll do a review of The Permanent Record, where he goes into details. It is an autobiography of him that is written by Edward Snowden. But he lays it out. He explains of what is going on. Now, incidentally, that Espionage Act, and I'm not being around here, is the same act that they're using against Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning is still in jail as long as that grand jury is out there. And they, of course, use it against him. And they would like to use it against Julian Assange when he is sent back here. Now, the situation is with Edward Snowden, he could spend the rest of his life in a jail here or stay in the Russian Federation at the invitation of the Russian government. Now, could the Russian government, a different regime, decide that to tell Ed, well, Ed, you're on your way to Washington? Well, that could happen. He explains that situation, and in Europe there's a talk of other governments that could grant him asylum, France and Germany. But no one takes asylum these days unless it is a guaranteed process, period. And he's been living there now for 6.5 years. He's now married. He talks about his girlfriend. When he left Hawaii, she had no idea where he went. He just disappeared one day. There was some help with some people. And he finally arrives in Hong Kong. And ordinary people helped him out there, which had their own problems. I haven't checked up on them, but in other episodes we'll talk about what happened to this family. Now, these people were just ordinary Hong Kongers. They were not people that had a special situation out there, political activists, etc. But he was able to slip literally out of Hong Kong, arrives in Moscow, and is met there, obviously, by intelligence officers. And they asked him, well, Ed, what do you have for us? Well, of course, Ed told them we destroyed our access to this troll of intelligence. We have zero. Period. So he got stuck in the airport there for 40 days and 40 nights. And that was not a story. What is it? I think Noah's Ark. I may be off on that one. Some people can write us and tell us about that story. But he was there. And finally, they let him live in the country. And his income now is from lecturing, of course, from the book, and various other things. He has a full life in Moscow, goes to restaurants, meets with friends, etc., has a married life, so he has a life. And he's had it for 6 years. So if you look at it, he's had 6 years of freedom in the Russian Federation. Now, if it came to an end, well, it came to an end. You look at the positives and negatives dialectically, which Ed Snowden is doing. But we have to fully understand how we get to 6.5 years later and this whole situation with the Russian Federation. The other argument, well, he's being used as a basic show trial type by the government of V.I. Putin. Well, whatever. The U.S. has got various so-called people, political people that they've granted asylum to from governments. We can only look at Venezuela and various other governments that the interest of the U.S. Was diametrically opposed to the governments that are there now, as in the situation in Venezuela with Comandante Madros. So, in other words, you have that situation there, the Sandinistas, etc. With the Cubans, you'll have defectors that come from the Democratic Republic of Korea. There was a story on some of those defectors. And go to the Republic of Korea, which is known as the South. And the story was on the BBC, but what happened to some of the defectors? Well, they're given certain types of aid, but then the aid can be cut off. So as a result, a woman and her child literally starved to death. Her bank account was empty. There was no food in the place. And when they found them, the bodies were decomposed. Snowden does not want that to happen to him. Therefore, he has to be very, very cautious about where he goes, unless he's obviously like what happened to Julian Assange. He was going, incidentally, to Ecuador. They were going to grant him asylum. That would have not been a very good choice because the government changed there, and they would have sent him straight away to D.C. and New York, actually D.C. So governments do change, particularly in some countries, and the whole formation itself changes. That could happen in Germany if the government decided to change. It could happen in France, but not likely, because there is a recognized a regimen of granting political asylum to people that are under threats for their political beliefs or political acts. And Ed Snowden fits into that category. That is the reason they charged him with the Espionage Act. They could have charged him with various other things, including stealing official secrets, etc., and taking them out of the country. But because of his unique situation, had he just taken the information and sent that straight away to the Russian Federation, it'd be a different situation. As he said, he would have got a ticker pay parade. He would have been in a limo, Red Square. He'd have got awards and everything. But he did not. He gave his information to private entities, and that is the situation there. Well, can you prosecute Ed Snowden under the Espionage Act and not prosecute the New York Times, the Washington Post, and various other newspapers? It was syndicated literally from sea to shiny shore. So newspapers in Northern California had it, newspapers in New Mexico, newspapers in Alabama and Mississippi, Tennessee, Vermont, in Boston, in New York, and you name it, those newspapers syndicated also. So we all found out the FBI's methods for spying on us and the rest of the world. That was exposed. Have they changed the methods? Well, the law has changed, as he talks about here. Now the National Security Agency, CIA types, etc., don't keep your metadata directly. They let the Googles and the phone companies do it. And when they need it, they send some paperwork over, maybe not, and get those records. Because their whole idea was, a typical big data operation, was just get everything from all citizens, and then narrow it down later to specific people that they were looking or have interest in. So that is to be warned. And since Ed Snowden left the country, now we have more and more CCTV in many major cities. We have the Googles are much stronger, the Facebooks, the Amazons. We have facial recognition, voice recognition. The wireless carriers, whomever they are, mine the metadata. Not only do they mine it, they also sell it to what's called data brokers. It's the same situation with license registrations of most of the states. The information brokers can buy that information, in other words, your address and various other things on the person. So if you have the address, you have them, period. And there's other data brokers that have social security numbers. There's just a ton of information out there, and much of it's been stolen. Look what happened to the credit agency that they were compromised, broken into, Equifax, and there's evidently a new one that just got broken into, but these things are broken into daily. So in other words, there's other access to the information that the NSA at one time was mining on everyone. But remember, Facebook has the same kind of data mining operation. They can get your conversations, etc. If you use WhatsApp, they can get, he talks a little bit about this. They have, not individually, but they have the conversations that you are sending from point A to point B. So even if you use Tor, you're secure, that whole idea from point A to point B. But encryption is very important, that you use encryption. That's how he, as he said, got away with it. So that is the Tor browsers out there that you can use, and various other things, pretty good encryption to secure your email, period. Does the CIA and company have a backdoor that? Well, it's possible. But what this does for us at WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network, we bring together much of our other work in the open source report. He's talking about open source, open systems. Even Google and Microsoft are talking about now open AI. That's open artificial intelligence. And these systems, incidentally, that Ed Snowden was monitoring, have nothing but AI. And remember, 6.5, almost 7 years. They are much better now. They have other capabilities with the phone companies, and there are few of those anymore. We're talking about the mobile phone companies. With the Facebooks, the world, the Twitters, the WhatsApps, other organizations out there that are available. Snapchat, chat, and it goes on and on. Instagram. I mean, all the things that are social media. But what is the biggest threat? The mobile phone, both voice and text messaging, because all that is in something called metadata, data, big data, and that is kept. And not only that, you have other kinds of things in the Internet of Things. If you want to find more about this, go find Brian Krebs on security. He has features. He used to be the Washington Post, and he has a book called Spam. You'll pick up much information as to how all of this is done, such as Snowden talks about your refrigerator. What food you have in the refrigerator. All this information is available, and it goes to central depositories. Literally, it's where it all goes. So if you have GPS and you have using Tesla or the GM product or whomever product you're using for your automobile, all that information is put into big, huge databases. So they know if you went to Aunt Martha's for Thanksgiving or a holiday in Maine or wherever you're going. So all that information is already out there on you. So that sort of makes, quote unquote, any crime that Mr. Snowden committed minor details. And it has not really been in the news very much at all here. And I was just looking at the NPR document. We'll finish this up. They say, well, he's a divisive figure. And a phone interview that he gave, he makes it very clear. It's not my choice to be here. This is what people forget. It's not my choice to live in Russia. Note that he sought asylum in 27 countries. The U.S. even canceled his passport. Now, literally, so he had if you have no passport, you can't go anywhere. He was working for the NSA as a contractor in Hawaii in 2013. He traveled first to Hong Kong, sharing secrets with several journalists. He was attempting to go to Ecuador for asylum, but was stopped in Moscow. Actually, they did him a favor there because Julian Assange is stuck in their embassy in Germany. In Britain, and they changed regimes there, and the U.S. was able to bribe the new regime, and that was the situation. But he goes on to say here, other European countries reached out impossible asylum, Germany, Poland, and he said, but they all fear U.S. retaliation. And this is one of the things that U.S. still is able to do, economic violence. U.S. Venezuela, U.S. Iran, etc. And he goes on to here talk about being at Best Buy. This is the Internet of Things, smart refrigerators, smart stoves, and down the name of the manufacturers, not the purchasers or the owners are the ones that ultimately control it. The more devices, the more you are hooked up, and people really don't talk about it. He also expressed a concern, we'll wind this up. He said the increasing of power of the executive branch, referring to Amnesty versus Clapper case, the executive branch sort of hacked the Constitution. And this is an interesting term. He told NPR the government has found ways to cut out the two branches of government that could have some checks. So in other words, the executive branch, of course now, and the person at the control handle there is DJ Trump, but it wouldn't matter. It could be Hillary the Monster Clinton. In fact, the monster would be more aggressive against the Ed Snowdens of the world as she was aggressive against Libya under the administration at that time of the late Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, who was murdered there. But this is the result of the Wilsonian foreign policy. You have to understand, it's racist. Doesn't matter which regime. John Kerry, Brother John Kerry. We supported Brother John Kerry. But Kerry was one of the basic people behind this. And then comes Lunchbox Joe Biden. We support, of course, Bernie Sanders. But anyway, nonetheless, he was in the situation, has to be in the loop, because that is what it's all come down to, is to stop, quote-unquote, leaking of the press. Now, it was totally different. I recall that back when Dr. Ellsberg was in the situation there. The nation as a whole rallied behind him. And the New York Times versus the Pentagon, they went to court, and they prevailed at the Supreme Court. But Julian Assange has not managed to do that. Nonetheless, on the 17th of September, 2019, this is Boston Red, the Jerry Pippen Memorial Broadcast Booth, and our episode has been Ed Snowden Patriot. Period. He's a patriot. Good day, and we'll see you later. Incidentally, we're working on the funeral of the late leader of Zimbabwe, President Robert Mugabe, who was had his funeral on over the weekend. Period. There. Good day.
Work for.
Sorry, I don't know your name.
Oh, sorry. My name is Edward Snowden. I go by Ed.
In 2013, I didn't know who Edward Snowden was. I had no idea he would become the whistleblower responsible for the biggest leak of top secret documents in history. Not long after, Hollywood came calling.
This is everything I have. They're gonna figure out what I've done.
Did you access an unauthorized program?
Despite being exiled from his home country, Snowden is now living a relatively normal life in Moscow.
Yeah, right.
He invited me to come out here to discuss the release of his memoirs, Permanent Record. He's usually shy about talking about his private life, but in the book, he talks freely for the first time about his relationship with his partner, Lindsay Mills. When she came to the door in Moscow, I mean, you said that you were braced for a slap in the face.
I mean, what would you do? You're married. If you ran out on your wife, and she sees you on the news, you're now wanted and can't come home again. And then months later, you see her. What would you expect? She's so much more than I'll ever deserve.
I mean, when did you first meet?
There's like a site called hotornot.com, and it was the most vain and basic venal thing in the world. And if you saw someone that you thought was attractive who was near you, you could say, I'm interested in meeting this person.
What did you rate her as?
She was a 10.
What did she rate you as?
Not a 10. But high enough that she clicked the meet me button.
The way she was treated in the media, how do you feel about that?
Lindsay's always been a much more complex figure than I think the media was ready to grapple with. They saw that she had been a pole dancing instructor, and things. There were videos on YouTube of her doing performances, and they're like, "Oh, she must be a stripper," because they reduce women to these sexualized objects. This sort of supporting role. They didn't look at her complexity. They didn't look at the fact that she's a photographer. They didn't look at the fact that she's a poet. They didn't look at the fact that she's a political being whose politics, in fact, shaped my own.
You're right about, when you go out in Moscow, you change your appearance a bit by, not wearing glasses or shaving or wearing a scarf or a hat. Why is it necessary to take these precautions? Are you scared that the CIA are going to snatch you, or what are you worried about?
Well, I don't actually live that way anymore. I go around much less incognito. But you have to remember that in the 2013 moment, I very much was a person, the most powerful government in the world, wanted to go away. They didn't care whether I went away to prison. They didn't care about whether I went away into the ground. They just want to be gone. and they wanted me no longer speaking. But I'm not going to let any kind of concern for what makes my life easier, for what makes my life safer, allow me to be less free.
You've travelled around Russia now. St. Petersburg?
I've been to St. Petersburg, I've been to Sochi. I love traveling, I still do, even though I can't cross borders now. One of the things that's lost in all of the problematic politics of the Russian government is the fact that this is one of the most beautiful countries in the world. The people are friendly, the people are warm. And when I came here, I didn't understand any of this. I was terrified of this place because, of course, they were the great fortress of the enemy. You know, how do you think a CIA agent looks at Russia? And it was never my plan to be here. But with time, with open eyes, you can see that our presumptions about a place are almost always different from the reality of it.
I went to Starbucks.
Yeah.
And there's a Krispy Kreme place.
Yeah, what people don't realize about Russia is you can get basically all the same things you can get in the United States. They got Burger King, they got McDonald's, they got Krispy Kreme.
I've got some in the cupboard there if you want one.
The only thing they don't have in Russia is Taco Bell.
Ah. Can you go out and converse to people in Russian? Is it good enough for that? Or?
As long as I've been sort of alive, a real thinking, breathing being, you know, from adolescence onward, my life has been mediated by a screen. And so when you ask about my daily life, yeah, I go out, I go to restaurants, friends come to visit, I have great conversations. But I'm an indoor cat, and that's by choice.
How big a danger is Donald Trump?
We have moved into a time where people care much more deeply about feelings than they do about facts. And this is a dangerous moment for democracies because people believe that once we have achieved and established a free and open society, that it will remain that way and will always be there. But the reality is things can backslide very quickly, and we have seen democracies fall in just a matter of a few years.
In the book, you come to the conclusion that maybe talking about surveillance, legislative change might not happen. So maybe the best way to resist is through a sort of mass international protest, in the way like Extinction Rebellion or Occupy Wall Street. I mean, that's basically what you're advocating now. Has that changed? Because I don't...
When our political systems are being slanted to deny us influence, when our economic systems are being shaped to prevent us from having an equal opportunity to benefit from the production that has been created, we need people to recognize these problems, to understand these problems, and then to be willing to give something up to change that problem. This is what we're struggling with on climate. This is what we're struggling with on so many fronts. Yes, people can believe that mass surveillance is wrong. Yes, people can believe that climate change is an enormous threat facing the future not of a country but of the planet. But it's not enough to believe in something. You have to be ready to stand for something if you want it to change. And so that is what I hope this book will help people come to decide for themselves. Are you ready?
He's one of the most famous whistleblowers of our time, a man who revealed the existence of US mass surveillance programs spying on citizens all around the world, Edward Snowden, former CIA employee and NSA contractor. Edward Snowden, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. More than 6 years after your revelations, do you know if the NSA surveillance programs have really been reviewed?
So they have been reviewed, but it's not in the kind of way that you or I would like them to be reviewed. I don't think the programs have been looked at with an eye for meaningful reforms on a deep and systematic level. What we have seen is changes in the laws in the United States and other countries around the world, actually, as well, to try to legitimize the surveillance by putting it on a sounder legal footing, particularly in the United States, for example. The NSA, their mass surveillance program regarding phone records, previously had the government collecting everybody's phone records and storing them inside the government. So the government just had a bucket they could sort of sift through and look at anything they want. They passed a law, the USA Freedom Act, that changed this and made that explicitly unlawful, which was already forbidden by the Constitution, but they were violating that law, and that's, of course, what I revealed in 2013. However, what they've done to maintain the same kinds of spying is to make a sort of Faustian bargain, like a devil's pact with the telecommunications companies, where they say, well, we, the government, will no longer hold these records ourselves, but we want to demand that you keep records on all of your customers for all of these phone calls. And then when we want these records, when we want to look into someone's private life, you simply have to provide all of these to us. So in terms of what does it mean for the average person, the government is still spying on basically everyone they want to and on a pretty extreme scale. But now we have a little bit more involvement by judges. It is an advance, but of course it's nowhere near enough.
You said in 2013, in the very first interview you gave after your disclosures, that your greatest fear would be that nothing would change after your leaks. Do you feel like something has changed today?
Oh, absolutely. When I came forward and I was making that statement, I was talking in the context of this whole story about surveillance and information collection, mass-scale monitoring and collecting profiles of everyone's private lives, both by the government and corporations, that this would be a 2-week story because the media would very quickly lose their focus on it. The governments would act to suppress reporting on this information. And what we actually saw was all of the government's attempts to sort of hide information or explain away their abuses actually led to further reporting and further interest. And now everybody in the world understands generally what's going on. Now, the problem is having a general understanding of something that's so technical and complex is not enough to protect yourself. But what's really changed most dramatically from the world of 2013 to the world of today is everybody is aware that Facebook is up to no good, that Google is up to no good, that all of these companies are really trying to shape and influence not just our societies, but our lives, our buying habits, every kind of general behavior that we have in a deeply targeted and personal way. And it's technology that is enabling this and making it all possible for the first time. Now, again, that hasn't solved the problem, but the first step to solving any problem is we have to create a shared sense of understanding. We need a common set of facts, and today we have that.
There's something I'd like to clarify. It's alleged that you took 1.7 million classified documents from the NSA when you left Hawaii. Hundreds have been shared with journalists so far. Are there more revelations to come in the future?
Well, I don't have any documents anymore. That's been the case since I left Hong Kong. I destroyed my copy of the archive before I had to escape because I didn't know what kind of governments were going to try to interfere or threaten me or bribe me or steal from me or, God knows what. So the only way to really protect the information was to not have it at all and trust the journalists to make the decisions about what should and should not be reported. Now, that reporting has continued for many years, and I would say you shouldn't expect any new bombshells. But what I would like to see in the years to come is the primary source material that hasn't been reported will probably be entrusted to academic institutions that are not reporting in the same way that network news might, right, or even print journalism, where they need a story that's, a few pages long or a few minutes long. But in fact, they can begin to investigate the system at the length of books, right?
Do you believe that our democracies are threatened today by a security drift, by new laws that affect our fundamental freedoms? For example, we've seen the emergency state in France or the Yarovaya law in Russia, this controversial anti-terror legislation that the Russian citizens themselves are calling the Big Brother law.
Yeah, absolutely. I was one of the ones who who was criticizing the Yurovaya Paket, or the Big Brother law in Russia as it was being proposed. Unfortunately, everyone knows the troubles of the Russian people and their relationship with the government. But I think it is new and really disappointing to see this kind of practice infecting the West, not on a onesies, twosies basis, but really on a comprehensive scale. In Canada, we've seen things like the C-51 bill. We've seen in Australia mandatory metadata retention. In the United States, of course, we sort of kicked off the trend with the Patriot Act in the wake of September 11th. And this is really fundamentally changing the boundaries of common rights that everybody uses in our daily lives. But it's problematic because it's only recently happening on this legal scale. And even here, what the law says and how the governments actually interpret those laws, the authorities, how the government interprets the authorities those laws are granting to them, is all happening in secret. So we have very limited understanding of what exactly our governments are doing, both against us domestically and in our name internationally.
And what about encrypted data? Is it still protected, or has the NSA found a way to read our messages, to follow our personal and private conversations? For example, when we are communicating on popular apps like WhatsApp, is that safe?
Strong encryption works. We know it works. Without strong encryption, I could not have communicated with journalists and really gotten away with it. But in fact, I did. However, encryption is not the answer to every security problem. One of the central tenets of internet communication that people who are using encrypted messengers don't really understand is even if you send a communication across the wire that's perfectly armored, think of like an armored truck on a highway, you can't see inside it. You don't know what it's carrying, but you still know what building it left from and what building it stopped at if you finish. And this is analogous to your phone contacting someone else. WhatsApp, which is now owned by Facebook, is becoming aggressively opposed to its customers' privacy, which is a big change from how it was operating when it was more privately held. What this means is they're going, well, we can't necessarily read your messages directly when you're using our messenger, but what we can do is see everyone that you're talking to, the frequency that you're talking to them with. And from that, we can derive a social graph, not just of you, but everyone who uses our platform. And from that, hopefully, a significant percentage of everyone in the world. And again, that's a dangerous thing that they should not be doing, and it should not be legal for them to do in the first place.
Some have called you a traitor, others a patriot or a hero fighting against a Big Brother. How would you describe yourself?
This is the question that I get a lot. People, they want to put me into a box. They want to heroize me, or they want to villainize me. But when I think of myself, I'm really no different from you. And I think that's really the fundamental political importance, if there is any, of my personal story. Is we're not all good, we're not all bad, we're not different sorts of people. When you start thinking about the world in that way, oh, there's heroes, and oh, there's these terrible people, you're distancing yourself from them. You're going, I can't be a hero, I can't be a villain, I'm just a normal person. The reality is there aren't, these different classes. We're all the same. What is different are the decisions we make. And this to me is a fundamentally powerful thing, because it means you're never more than one decision away from doing something that can change the world. And I believe that's true of all of us.
And living in exile today in Russia, what is the hardest for you? What do you miss the most?
My family, of course. I think for everybody, it's hard to be separated from home. And for me, it's been a very long time now, going on 6 years.
And you haven't seen them at all for the past 6 years?
I have. They have visited me in Russia, but of course I can't visit them. I can't go home in the same way, and that's unfortunate. But Some of the sting is being pulled out of exile by technology. The way that we communicate today, now I can communicate with my family. People ask, where are you living? What are you doing? And of course, I'm stuck in Moscow, not by choice. But I tell people, I sleep in Moscow. But technology lets me live all over the world. I can have a conversation with you in Canada, in France, in Germany, and then talk to students at a library in Philadelphia all in the same day. And that's never been possible before. And I think it's really starting to limit the power of exile as a tool of governments in order to silence dissent.
And how is your life on a daily basis? Do you work? Are you paying rent?
Yeah, of course I'm paying rent. It's the one thing none of us can escape from. I am professionally a speaker. And so when I do many of these events around the world, some of them are for corporations, some of them are for conferences, some of them are for universities. And that's been very fortunate for me because it's allowed me to make quite a comfortable living, actually, for somebody who can't travel. I work increasingly with the Freedom of the Press Foundation in the United States, where they elected me president of the board.
How do you cope with still being a wanted man? Are you looking over your shoulder when you walk in the streets in Russia?
I've done it for so long now that really it's you don't think about it. But I do still live in kind of an unusual way, I think, to normal people. I never use credit cards, right? Like, how do I even get this without applying in my name and putting down an address and these kind of things? And of course, when we know that there's all of these agencies that are raiding these databases for details about our private lives, to me, that starts to look like things that's not a good deal. Instead, I pay for things by cash. But in terms of like, do I walk around in fear at this point? No, it's, I ride the metro, I go to restaurants like everybody else. But are there greater risks? Sure, of course, and I'll always live with them. But that's really the question we have to ask ourselves. Are we going to permit institutions to bully us out of living in the way that we believe is right? And for me, the answer is no. I've done something that I believe in, and if someone wants to harm me for that, well, that will just prove what those people are like.
Before current US President Donald Trump was sworn in January 2017, former Deputy CIA Director Michael Morrell wrote that handing you over would be the perfect inauguration gift from Putin to Trump, the Trump-Putin relationship being unclear. Do you fear that at some point the Russian president might decide to hand you over to the US?
There's nothing I can do about that if that would ever happen. I can say that when you look historically for any analog to that, it's simply never happened before. At the same time, it's kind of cheeky, but not really surprising that a former head of the CIA is going to go, let's put in the newspapers. This would be such a friendly gesture if you help us get rid of one of our enemies. That will do that, sort of pave over all the damage between our relationship. But I think that's actually extremely dark when you think about what that says for the character of the United States intelligence community, when they're starting to say things like, well, as long as they help us hide the bodies, we're all friends.
And do you believe you would have a fair trial if judged in the U.S.?
Well, that's a good question. It's actually got nothing to do with what I believe. It's what the law permits. I've been charged under a very unusual law in the United States. It's the Espionage Act of 1918. And this is a law that does not permit the people who are accused of it of making a defense to the jury, a moral defense to the jury, of explaining why you did what you did, what your motivations were. It permits very unusual court proceedings, court procedures that allow them to close the courtrooms and give secret evidence and use secret witnesses who are in disguise, all kinds of crazy things like that. The question really is for you and everyone else. If the only trial that the law permits is one where the jury cannot consider why the person committed this crime at all into their deliberations, can you even have a fair trial? Is that a possibility? I would argue, of course, not.
How do you envision your future? Do you think that one day you will see home again?
I do, actually. And this is one of the things that I think is becoming more clear year after year. I came forward in 2013, and everyone in political life in the United States really allied against both myself and the journalists and newspapers who brought this story forward, because it implicated them in all three branches of government in a kind of clandestine criminality that was not just taking place domestically, although it absolutely was happening domestically, but around the world. It was one of the largest scale violations of human rights, since it was happening billions of times per day, that we've really ever seen. But now we're in 2019. And all of the sort of accusations against me in 2013, when they were trying to malign my character and get people to just question the story by, shooting the messenger, have started to fall away. The government's investigated me. They know I'm not a Chinese spy. They know I'm not a Russian spy. They know I'm not anything but what I claim to be. And what we see now is bit by bit candidates for president in the United States. We see ordinary people, everybody coming to a consensus that even if they don't like me personally, which is, more than fine, or even if they think, what I did was risky in certain ways, as all publication and reporting is, on balance, we are better off for knowing what our government was doing in secret. This has not risked lives. This has saved lives.
Edward Snowden, thank you for speaking to us here on France 24. And thank you to all of you for watching. Do stay tuned for more news on France 24.
Edward Snowden has written a book. It is a memoir, a coming-of-age with the Internet story, a spy tale, and as critics would say, an attempt to try to justify betraying his country by a man who was charged in 2013 with 2 counts of violating the Espionage Act and with theft of government property, confidential national security information. Mr. Snowden's book is Permanent Record. Edward Snowden joins us now from Moscow. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me on.
I think a lot of people don't want to hear anything you have to say until I've asked you this question. Are you being used by Vladimir Putin?
No, I don't think so. When people look at this, particularly with Russia in the news as much as it is, there's always this cloud of suspicion that's leveled against anybody who can be in the most stretched way associated with Russia. It wasn't
most stretched way. You're living there in Moscow. You have been for 6 years.
Right, but it was not my choice to be here. And this is what people forget. I applied for asylum in 27 different countries around the world, and it was the government, the United States government, then Secretary John Kerry, that canceled my passport as I was leaving from Hong Kong en route to Ecuador. And this locked me in place. I believe they panicked. And I think the reason that I'm in Russia today is because what we know, this was actually publicly reported in 2013, every time one of these other countries, one that the United States public would be much more comfortable with, a France, a Norway, a Germany, one of 2 people would call the foreign ministry of that country. And it would be either Secretary of State John Kerry or then Vice President Joe Biden. The idea here is they would go, look, we understand that he has been charged with political crimes. This means you don't qualify for extradition. And you almost always do qualify for asylum protections. And the government, we know you can do this, but if you do, we want you to understand there will be a response. We're not going to say what it will be, but it will be severe because we don't want to see the public seeing this guy as a whistleblower, which the public then was coming around to do.
You say the U.S. government panicked. Did the U.S. government panic, or just they felt it was important to the national interests of the United States to make certain your movement was limited?
What is the thing they're arguing is in the interest of the United States here? Sort of like in your introduction, you say, some people say I betrayed the United States. Well, how did I betray the United States? All of my information was given to the American public through some of the most trusted institutions in journalism, institutions like the Washington Post. Now, as a condition of access to this archive material, these journalists were required not to publish any story that they thought was harmful. No story simply because it was interesting. No story simply because it was newsworthy. Only stories that they were willing to make an institutional argument and stand for. It was in the public interest to know. And here, as an extraordinary safeguard on top of this, I required each of the journalists working with this material in advance of publication to go to the government before they ran the stories. And this is why in 2013, we heard exactly the extraordinary rhetoric that you raised before. But now in 2019, we don't hear this anymore. We have seen the laws changed. We have seen the programs change. And we have even seen officials in the United States intelligence community, former Deputy Director Richard Leggett, for example, say that he thought the NSA had made a mistake in concealing this program, the particularly unconstitutional phone records program, because he believed that if the NSA hadn't played these secrecy games and denied the American people the right to know, much less the right to vote on it, they could have won that persuasive argument. But they didn't do it. They had made a mistake, and it had harmed the rights of everyone in the United States and everyone around the world as a consequence. And they call me the traitor?
You recount in this book how Russian intelligence representatives met you at the airport in Moscow and said to you, I'm going to quote from your own book, "Life for a person in your situation can be very difficult without friends who can help. Is there some information you could share with us?" You're there 6 years later. You can see why people might be suspicious, can't you?
I was trapped in that airport for 40 days. If I had played ball, I would have left day one on a limo. I would have been living in a palace. You would see them giving me parades in Red Square. The reality is this. I had destroyed my access to all of the classified material that I provided to journalists before leaving Hong Kong, precisely because I didn't know what was going to happen next.
Are you, at the same time, though, you're in Moscow. Are you a very smart man, naive to think that Vladimir Putin is going to give you asylum without expecting something in return?
All throughout the Cold War in the United States, we protected dissidents from the Soviet government. These are, writers, these are speakers, these are physicists. These are not people who can benefit the United States government, even if they had wanted to. And we protected them nonetheless because of the message it sent. Now, the Russian government doesn't get many chances in this context, internationally on the global stage, to do the right thing. I have been criticizing the Russian government while I am here. What more can I do to satisfy you or any of these critics who hold these positions? The reality is there is nothing that will satisfy them because it is their suspicion, it is their skepticism, it is their distrust of the Russian government as an institution which is motivating this.
I mean, do I have to detail for you the ways in which the Putin government has earned some suspicion?
No, absolutely not. Again, I agree with you. Look, this is why I have been criticizing the Russian government. There's no distance between us on that. I'm not saying Vladimir Putin is an angel. I'm not even saying Vladimir Putin is a decent guy. What I'm saying is you have to understand there doesn't need to be a quid pro quo here for it to make sense.
Edward Snowden. Elsewhere in the program, he talks about his work at the NSA before he leaked classified information and tells us what's keeping him from returning to the U.S. to face trial.